Okay, fine. Yeah, welcome to One VI Agenda. Can you, is it being picked up properly? Dr. Corbin, you'll have to keep talking so we can see if we can get you.
Yes. Let me just express all the best for the new year to all my friends and colleagues in the Virgin Islands.
Okay, great. Okay, good. So we started the conversation. I'm not sure if you were hearing most of it. We spoke about a topic which I think was internal in terms of elections, when we may have it, if we have it, and how we will move it forward. So I think that the second topic we have is concerning the constitutional review. Now, you have done studies here in the Virgin Islands. You did it in Bermuda, and I think that you with the United Nations doing some others. So fill us in on, in the perspective of the Virgin Islands, and where we are with the constitutional review with this phase, because we know that in 1950 we had it restored, and from then to where we are. So you can just highlight to us with some of the issues as you see them, if you could.
Consistent with the process of evolution, examining the areas in which the territorial constitutional order can be revised if as appropriate. The issue, of course, is in relation to the relationship between the territory and the administering power. And, of course, within the constitutional order is a delineation of power. A division of responsibilities, if you will, and the elected government, of course, operates and on the basis of delegated power from the United Kingdom. And this is essentially what constitutional reviews examine, essentially the structures of government. In some cases, it also addresses the question of the degree of delegation of power, and I think there's also, as was mentioned earlier by Shaina, the issue of Turks and Caicos Islands, where you found there was, as a result of a commission of inquiry, there was a reverse delegation of power. So I think that these are some of the procedures that take place in the process maintained through that period to determine through the Constitutional Commission and who will be examining and making recommendations on the basis of the terms of reference.
Okay, great. And have you seen the items of which the Commission have been asked to review, and any of those specifics? Have you seen any of those?
I believe I have seen the terms of reference, and I think several of them are, of course, important in terms of my view of the situation from the broader perspective, particularly in relation to the powers, the division of powers. I think one of the areas relates to the reserved powers of the governor and the question of devolution of power and as well. And I think what's important, I think there is a distinction to be made between devolution of power and delegation of power. And I think that all of the territories exercise delegation of power because, in fact, delegation is reversible, whereas devolution is virtually irreversible. So I think when we speak about the kinds of powers that are exercised, the powers are in fact reversible, and indeed, in the whole concept of territorial status was in fact originally designed to be a preparatory status. That is to say that the territories would be in a position of gaining experience, expertise, and preparing for the final delegation, the final devolution of power, essentially the transfer of power under the Decolonization Declaration of the United Nations in 1960. And that, of course, comes, and of course, as a result, there's the responsibility of the country that administers the territories to provide for the advancement of the territories to achieve the full measure of self-government. And that is referred to as the process of self-determination, in which case it results, and that process results in decolonization. Now, there's a lot of discussion about self-determination, and there's some misunderstanding with respect to that term. Self-determination does not equate to independence. Self-determination is a process, and the process results in decolonization, and decolonization can take several forms, independence being one, integration being another, and free association being a third.
Okay, great. You have noted, because I've sent you, and you have corrected me on that, but in the version announced, we've added another two, because there's a school of thought which says you must also determine whether or not you want to have your status remain with additional powers. But of course, they will have, those additional powers will have to be agreed by the administrating state, i.e. the United Kingdom. So I think that they have expressed themselves as it relates to whether or not they're prepared to have any further delegation of powers above and beyond what have been gained since the 2007 Constitution. That is one, and then the other would, so what do you feel in terms of are we correct to have that additional term listed as one of the areas that we can seek?
Well, I think it's a question of remaining in the same status, effectively with further delegation of power. I think if you compare, for example, the delegation that exists in Bermuda, you referred to that assessment that was done there very recently, that you will find that Bermuda has the essentially advanced a form of delegation of power. But essentially, however, within the framework of any advancements, or in fact in remaining in the status quo remains with respect to the unilateral power of the cosmopole to legislate for the territories, to effectively operate in the same fashion that they are. So in other words, the power, asymmetrical power, the difference in power relationship, that will remain, even if you have additional powers, because again, they are delegated powers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I got you. Okay, and the fifth one, because Barbados just went and joined Trinidad, I think it is, and joined Guyana in terms of being a republic. And it is not the same status that Jamaica and Antigua and St. Kitts and St. Martin has so far. So the other one was whether or not the independence of which, the three areas, the association, integration, independence, but being a republic is one of those areas in terms of self-determination?
Well, I think independent states take a number of forms. Countries that were formerly territories of the United Kingdom maintained in the beginning the system whereby the crown was the titular head of state, the king or queen or king rather, at this stage, is a titular head of state. But of course, the person is represented by the crown is represented by the governor general, who is usually a person from the country itself. But if you examine the powers of the governor general, they're essentially ceremonial. It's much far different than the powers of a territory where the governor has reserved powers. So these are independent countries that have chosen to maintain the crown as the titular head of their government. There are many, not just in the Caribbean, and a number in Africa as well. Now, the idea is, in fact, even in the Pacific region. Now, the idea is that countries all of these countries belong to the Commonwealth of countries, but it is also necessary to recognize that one does not have to have that model of government to be a member of the Commonwealth. So when countries like Barbados, as you mentioned, shifted to Republican status, it is simply a move to maintain a different level of arrangement. A number of countries have also, for example, removed the Privy Council as their final court of law. So now they have signed on to the Caribbean Court of Justice. So there are a number of stages, if you will, of moving forward. But it's just a question of what the people decide they wish to do.
Okay, great. One of the major topics I think that we have to look at, because one of the areas that the Commission of Inquiry was asked to look at as to whether or not to look at the provision in terms of the vision of the country. In the preamble on page 5 of our Constitution, it lists about 7 or 8 of the vision, and whether or not it is supported in the body of the Constitution. So I am saying that 1960, when the I think it's when the resolution, it might have been in the 40s, the resolution 1514 came in terms of, self-governing states. But Article 73, what year did that come? 61, 62, 63? Somewhere there, where we are looking in terms of educating, the C-24, educating the non-self-governing states as to the stages and in terms of self-determination. What is it that we ourselves would have to put into a constitution so that we can get the framework readied? How could it be best reflected in the Constitution? Now, I'll just give you some of my thoughts, and then you can see whether or not it is along the same line. The time frame for public education seems to be important, because folks are saying we don't know enough about it. We need to be educated. But my feeling is that you have to put this time frame and have a time frame set. Once that time frame is reached, a date by which you conduct a referendum, simple majority referendum, on the options that are out there. Number 3, enough provisions to ensure the accountability and transparency is in there to make sure that the citizens know that elected officials are accountable, they're transparent, and prudence and everything. The other one is whether or not a recall or censure provision, would that be able to add to the accountability and transparency so that you don't have to wait 48 months each time before elected officials are called to order, and what provisions those hold. There are strong arguments against term limits, but it is something that people have said for the premier and deputy premier, for instance, as opposed to all members in the small population state. It might be difficult for term limits to be practical. And then whether or not, you talked about whether or not the Privy Council versus the Caribbean Coast, Court of Justice becomes the particular, the actual justice or the legal system. But should the body of the Constitution have in it the timeline, time frames, and the how-tos, so that we can then set a time frame for this? Does that make sense at all?
Well, I certainly, I wouldn't want to indicate what I think should be in it, in the Constitution, but I think that all of these things are I'm sure being discussed, and that will be the determination. Remembering that in the final analysis, the document would be approved, or aspects of the recommendations would be approved by the United Kingdom government. So it's really a question of what the procedure is leading up to that point. Now, you mentioned earlier Article 73, which is really the key article of the United Nations Charter, which is, I think, there's some indication that that Article 73 is a resolution, but in fact it is the main body of the United Nations, Chapter 11, Article 73, which identifies that the full measure of self-government is necessary, and that full measure must be brought, and the territories must be advanced to that full measure of self-government by the country that administers it. So this is the obligation, international legal obligation of the Cosmopole to bring the territories to the full measure of self-government. The question then becomes how do you define that full measure? And I think this is where you have the preparatory process and all of the constitutional developments which are taking place, the reviews and the modernization process. All of this is consistent with this preparatory process.
Okay, great. And I think that is very important. Now, you may not be able to answer this, but there was a 1986 letter that the United Kingdom had sent to the C24 body stating that there is no indication that the remaining territories have any appetite for further self-governance, and that the works of the C24 should be brought to an end. So the question becomes, is there in your view, a commitment based on actions the United Kingdom has in terms of making sure that what was agreed by Article 73, Chapter 11, whether or not this could be effected without a true will to get it done?
Well, I think that you can look at the article and recognize that it is a mandate of the entire United Nations system, not a mandate of a particular committee, which was formulated to do certain elements of this. There is a clear obligation to bring the territories to self-government. Now, if in fact the feeling is that the territories, or any territory for that matter, has achieved full self-government under the current arrangements, then one would have expected that a resolution would have been submitted to the United Nations to remove the territories from the list. That has not happened, and I think it would be difficult for the United Nations to determine on the basis of the objective reality of the particular dependency arrangements that these territories have achieved the full measure of self-government. The territories may be on the road toward that. Some have stagnated, but in some cases, the idea of having achieved that full measure is certainly, anyone that would argue that would not necessarily be arguing something that's consistent with what is actually the asymmetrical power relationship between a territory and a cosmopole, where one has the overarching unilateral authority over the other.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that discourse right there. Before Shaina comes in, I just wanted to just get one more thing straight. There are the many persons who are concerned, I wouldn't call them doubters, but concerned that the quest for self-determination is a self-inflicted quest, and it is intended to avoid accountability and transparency. Can you speak to that in terms of, because you spoke of it in terms of a mandate from the United Nations, as opposed to a dream of politicians going to sleep, waking up, having a dream, and then they want to go independent tomorrow. So speak to it as it relates to the United Nations from 1960, having this as a mandate, and 17 countries only remaining from the, I think it was 200 and somewhat countries, wasn't it, that have been able to fulfill that mandate, and 17 remain. So is this quest for self-determination equal to a need to avoid transparency and accountability?
Well, I don't know about that, but I think I would say that the issue of self-determination, as you indicated, numbers over almost 200 territories over the years since the charter was adopted and also accelerated. I think you find that there have been 3 periods of decolonization. This is in fact addressed in the assessment on PVI. The idea that there was a initial period right after the charter adopted in 1945 up to 1960, where there was the beginning stages of trying to determine what these countries were going to do with the territories that they acquired over the years. By 1960, as you mentioned, the Colonization Declaration, Resolution 1514, was adopted, and that essentially talked about the importance and the requirement for transfer of power to the territories. But a second resolution was also adopted, 1541, which identified the minimum standards for the 3 options that provide for the full measure of self-government. So from that period, 1960 to 1990, most of the territories that became fully self-governing, either through independence, through integration, or through free association. The remaining were territories at the beginning of 1990. It was a very interesting convergence point because it was in fact resulting in the end of the Cold War at that particular period, and also the independence of Namibia in Africa, which meant that the territories remaining were small islands. So there was a change in the thinking as a result of the UN looking at a reform process and also determining where some areas would be focused upon and some areas would be downplayed. I think it created a bit of a paradox because as a result of that, there were several decades created, international decades for the eradication of colonialism. We are presently in the 4th decade. And the first decade was created in 1990 for the purpose of accelerating the process of self-determination and consequent decolonization for the small island territories remaining. However, there was also a stiffening of position from many of the administering powers that the territories were not prepared for change, nor were they interested in change. And so that created a bit of a stalemate. So if you look at the numbers now from 1990 forward, only if you a little bit earlier than that, 1983, where St. Kitts and Nevis became independent. In 2002, Timor-Leste in the Pacific region became independent. But no other territories from that period to today have advanced to the full measure of self-government. So you have a bit of a problem in terms of implementing the mandate.
I see. Okay. And I said one more, but I do have one more. How small is too small in terms of independence? Because some of the concerns, because you see, education of our people is going to be key, and I'm not here to make up anyone's mind, but there are some concerns that people have. Is a 30,000 population, in our case, I think Anguilla is what, 15, 16, 17,000? Mm-hmm. Is a 30,000 population too small for consideration as it relates to independence?
Well, one of the things that the UN, for example, reinforces year after year is size is not a factor in terms of the kind of moving forward in political and constitutional development. At the same time, it's also recognized that, and consistent with this, that there are countries with smaller populations that are independent. In the Pacific, for example, you have several small countries. Nauru, for example, is less than 30,000 persons. The St. Kitts and Nevis is not terribly more much more than persons than that. I'm not sure what the population is, but it certainly isn't that much greater. The question really is in today's world is independence. Independence is different than what it was in the earlier years. Independence today is more of interdependence. You have, and we spoke about this significantly in other areas of the assessments that we've done. The issue is looking at the possibilities, for example, of defense being operated within the framework of a regional defense system or agreements with other countries. External affairs is a similar vein. At the same time as so you don't necessarily require this. It's not a standalone independence that some people perceive it to be, but it is rather something which permits a wide degree of participation and collaboration with other countries and regional and global institutions that are very, very important. At the same time, even within the framework of the evolution and development, you will find that there will be assistance provided to further the country as it transitions into whatever new status it will become. And this is something which the United Nations has programs that have been successful in moving countries forward in that respect, if in fact that is the decision of the people in a referendum or other form of popular consultation.
Okay, great. Shaina, I'm sure you have a question.
Well, first off, let me just say good night to my good friend, Dr. Corbin. We've actually been, I think the most recent conversation we had is that I hosted a panel discussion with himself and Miss Shirley Osborne at the Literary Festival. And he shared a lot of great information, some of which he touched on tonight. But on this, I don't know if it's something to pose to Dr. Corbin, but again, on the matter of decolonization, I started to believe, and now I'm really more firm about it, that those questions that were put in the terms of reference, and I think those were more so that came out of the COI report that spoke about our self-determination, the path for that the government needed to create a decolonization commission.
Yes, sir.
Which is basically similar to how the Constitutional Review Commission is set up, to explore the matter of decolonization separate and apart. Because in my mind, we need to have a full discussion around, as he explained, what decolonization means, self-determination as a process. And from there, have the country decide, what it wants to do. From there, then we can say, okay, let's go and modify the Constitution to look a certain way to get us to this path. So as you were saying, it creates a timetable where we might say we address this level of concerns first in this first review, and then maybe 5 years later, there's an assessment, and then we continue until we get to the end result that came out of the Decolonization Commission. Because I feel as if we kind of like convoluted stuff, because even when you brought forward the changes for the structure of the House of Assembly, I started to think back, when was the last time we did a district boundary commission?
That's good.
So, and again, that's how that would, to me, that's what's needed to inform some of these constitutional, the commission's terms or references, not just from public consultation or even their own research, because we expect that they would do their own research into a lot of those things that we, the public, don't know anything about in terms of a lot of the committees and stuff. So I would like to hear, Dr. Corbin's thoughts on that, if it's something where, again, we probably needed to split out, or a recommendation from the Constitutional Commission. In my mind, is starting to be that they should say, we can't say for certain this is what should go into the Constitution now, because it should be informed by a decolonization commission.
Right. Okay. I guess that is along the line that they had asked Dr. Corbin in terms of the statutory bodies that are in the Constitution now. Do we need another one, the Decolonization Commission, so that it will
the decolonization wouldn't stay. Like just like how this constitutional commission got that statutory commission, they actually want to have that as a fixed body to regulate all the statutory boards. If I understood that, yes,
right.
That's different.
No, because there are a number of bodies that are in there, set aside from the overarching one.
Yeah.
But we wanted to make sure that the body of the Constitution reflects the actual vision of the people and a time frame for it, and the particular studies, because as you say, Dr. Corbin, it have actually divisions within the United Nations that can come and look in terms of given an invitation, given the kind of education that is necessary for a citizen to better understand, isn't it?
Oh, yes. If there, in fact, is a process that there are mechanisms within the United Nations system that are able to provide education, provide basically unbiased information with respect to options. But further on, you also have these kinds of technical cooperation activities which exist in the Virgin Islands already involved in many of the institutions, such as the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, UNESCO. So there's already this very strong involvement with respect to international organizations, and which has been long-standing. And so these things are factored into the preparatory phase, and you find that as a result, this creates significant capacity to do the things which would be required. The capacity has already been created and continues. So as a result of that, there are other elements within the UN system, the other offices and specific technical areas that may be useful in terms of furthering the evolution of the capacity, so that effectively the development of the capacity is well on the way. And you've got, for example, the issue of the financial services industry, where you have great capacity. So the issues are just generally speaking how to structure it. You mentioned reviewing. I think the terms of reference, I believe, of the commission relates to reviewing the next step towards self-determination, and I think that's probably a determination that would be made by the commission as to what it may recommend in terms of what are those next steps, and some of the things that Shaina was just speaking about. I think are possible ways to move forward.
Okay, great. Well, it'll be important to note that the Premier, as Deputy Premier, had traveled to 2 or 3 of the C24 meetings and have stated the concerns of the Virgin Islands as to we still have the quest or the desire to look in terms of self-determination. And there was a statement, a joint statement by the United Nations, I think it was, that spoke of the actual Commission of Inquiry and they spoke of the particular order in council as not being a favorable step towards partnership. So I think that it is important to note that, and that particular ruling will be shared on the particular, to the public, so that they're well aware that these steps have been taken. I know in 2019, 20, and 21 maybe that we did it, and Dr. Benito Whitley had traveled, and he had made statements concerning this. So there is representation from here to the United Nations, to the C24 group, and I think that we have to continue along that line, but we have to have equal zest.
Yeah, I'd like to
commitment.
see a mission trip.
A mission trip, that's right.
That's what I would love to see them do now, because I think the last one...
I agree that, in fact, the involvement at the United Nations through this process of the the C-24, and also the Fourth Committee, which is the Committee of the Whole. All of member states of the United Nations are in that committee. And it's very critical that the member states of the United Nations hear the views and the perspectives of the elected government. It is often the case that they've heard in previous years that territories in general had no interest in moving forward, and that precipitated a colonial legitimization mindset, in which case the attempt to encourage the view that the territories were fine the way they are, even though the model, the dependency model itself, is something which is in need of real, true modernization. So that this is something that's very critical and very important for territories to participate in the United Nations process, to share the views. It could be non-governmental organizations, governments, all have a role to play in this, and so that the United Nations gets a broader perspective on this, and it to the credit of the Premier and the Deputy Premier, as well as Mr. Benito Wheatley, for participating as a special envoy in the role in the United Nations process, but also in CARICOM and in OECS, where you've got also very strong regional support. And this is critical. Regional support on issues of this nature is very important, and to the credit of the government, they've been able to gain that support from the countries of the region, and that's very important in terms of moving forward.
Well, yes, I know, because the former Premier, Honorable Foy, he was critical, and he had basically made sure that every year that actually proper representation was made. But the envoy and the trip coming here, I think, is going to be important in order for us to do it. So we have some work to do if we want to be serious about the time frame, the timeline, and the education particular segment of it, so that we can then put the question to it, so that the actual conclusions reached by the UK might well be a different one reached by your people. So any final words, Dr. Corbin?
Well, I thank you for that opportunity to be with you this evening. And I know that the situation, it continues to move forward. You have very strong players and actors in various places in addressing these issues, and at the highest level. I'm very happy to continue to listen with interest to your programs on ZBVI, as well as listening to developments taking place regionally and globally, because we are not alone in this. There are 17 remaining territories, but as you look in the region itself, there are 7 formally listed by the United Nations as non-self-governing, but we also have a number of partially integrated and semi-autonomous arrangements that exist, and that also have some particularly difficult political and constitutional challenges that the people are trying to deal with and address.
That is correct.
St. Martin, that's one of them, and as well as the entire Netherlands, former Netherlands, Antilles Islands. They're all having some issues with regards to their political evolution. So we are not alone in this. It behooves us to seek to maintain collaboration with other territories, and Shaina is a major player in this territories talk.
Territory talk, that's right.
I think, which is like really, really important, because we get an opportunity to understand the dynamics of what's happening in other parts of the region as well. And this is very useful for us to know, because sometimes I heard the phrase played the same playbook, and Shaina mentioned that with Mr. Turks and Caicos. I said, it's almost like a carbon copy. I'm
going to give Dr. Corbin a chance to say his final words. We have 6 more minutes. Dr. Corbin, you want 1.5 of those 6 minutes?
No, I'm listening with great interest. And, I think that one of the last things I would say is that the result of the constitutional review would be
Hold on a second.
Hopefully a new document,
yes.
Or a revised document. The status of the territory would remain the same.
Okay, great.
And I think so. The next point after that is to move, when you're talking about the political status aspect of it. That's the next stage, and perhaps that is what is being referenced here in terms of what might be included as a recommendation emerging from the constitutional review process.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Corbin, and I want you to continue to listen.